too high? All right. Well, the school year is upon us. I don't know if you feel it, if you see it in traffic, and we definitely, those of us who have school-age children experience. If you go to stores, to department stores, they're like full of children. And we were at, I think last Sunday, we stopped by Carlsbad Mall, and somebody walks in the store, and it's full of people. Somebody says, "What's going on? Why is it here?" Apparently, somebody looks and says, "Well, it's a school year. So we have to get through the beginning of the school year, but also it's an exciting opportunity for us." That's why I always like to start the school year to look at something fundamental, something important. So we continue our sermon series, Back to School. In the beginning, and last week we talked about God and our ability to see God, and God cannot be explained through science or other means that the humans normally apply, and the five senses even, to see God, you need to see it with your heart. Kind of continue along the same lines. We go back to the beginning of the book of Genesis, the story of creation, and focusing now on what happened and what transpired there, because as much as we'd like to focus on God, we also look around and we see the world, and how we engage the world, how we come into the world, and what happens when we are in the world. This was one of the most confusing things for believers to figure out from the beginning of time. So, focusing on the World 101 today. In the beginning of the school year, imagine for a moment that you are not in San Marcos, California, and you came to school, I don't know, almost 1800 BC. Anytime since that, imagine that you are somewhere in Babylon. And I don't know what they do to pull or to go to school in Babylon. Do you need to fill up the shots, any vaccinations or anything, or any prerequisites? But the fact is that the school starts. And if you take a class in Babylon and the history of the world in Babylon, I would bet the first lesson would begin with something like this. When the heavens above did not exist, and the earth beneath had not come into being, there was Apsu, the first in order, their begetter, and Demiurge, Tiamat, who gave birth to them all. They had mingled their waters together. Before meadowland has coalesced with reed bed was he found, when not one of the gods had been formed, or had not come into being, when no destinies had been decreed. The gods were created within them. If that sounds familiar to you, it sounds kind of like the beginning of the book of Genesis. It should, but also it is something different. This is the beginning of the passage or the myth that is called Enuma Elish, or another way, the myth of the seven tablets. This is the story of creation according to the Babylonian history and Babylonian mythology. It was discovered that during the archaeological dig in Nineveh, remember the city of Nineveh, which is now the territory of Iraq. It's a Babylonian story of how this world came into existence. In the beginning, the Enuma Elish can be translated as when on high, which just kind of sounds like what in the beginning, just like the title of the book of Genesis. The story sounds familiar. They begin familiar when there was nothing in the beginning. But this is where they start differ. Because the story of Enuma Elish, the story of creation of the world, according to Babylonian mythology, is very different from a Genesis story. Not to give you all the details, a lot of people don't remember it, quite frankly, don't care about them anyway. But the story goes something like this, that Apsu and Tiamat, they became a couple and they engender gods. And the gods, their children, supposed to be, start anointing them. They become really rambunctious, annoying children. probably before they even were children, they became all teenagers. So what happens to the parents who have teenagers? You're trying to send them off to college as soon as possible. I think we should start accepting when they're 12. This is exactly what happened to Apsu and Tiamat, and they were so annoyed that Apsu decided that he's gonna get rid of his own children. And Tiamat, as a mom, was trying to protect them. So to make the long story short, they started fighting, and one of the Apsu's grandchildren, Apsu's children found out that Dad is trying to kill them. So he did the favor to Dad, and he killed Dad. Not only he killed Dad, on a Dad's grave, he conceived another child of his, so it would be Apsu's grandchild named Marduk. Marduk was a grandchild, was very powerful. He was able to control the winds. And you can imagine the story is the one who controls the winds is the one who has the power. So Tiamat gets upset that the children murdered her husband, even she didn't care about her husband. See how it gets really like a Hollywood soap opera? It's very confusing, and it should be. That's how life often is. So Tiamat gets upset, and she starts fighting with her grandson, Marduk. And Marduk's father, Enki, actually goes and trying to fight his grandma. Grandma defeats Enki. Enki comes back, and Marduk says, Dad, you cannot handle it. I'm going to go fight Grandma. So Marduk goes, and actually he gets into a fight with Grandma, and he's able to grab an arrow and pierce Grandma's chest and kills Grandma. And out of Grandma, Marduk takes Grandma and divides Tiamat in two halves, and one half becomes the earth, and the other half of Tiamat becomes the heaven. And the two great rivers of the ancient world, two great rivers of Mesopotamia, which is Euphrates and Tigris, they're the two rivers that start flowing because as she is dying, Tiamat is crying, and out of her eyes run two beautiful rivers. This is the story of creation of the earth. If you imagine, this is how a world came to be. And what do we find? Just not to get confused. So distance, not because people love each other, not out of love or desire to create something beautiful. The world is the result of the war and the fighting and the result of violence. And the world is basically a corpse of a goddess divided in half. Did the gods stop there and say, well, that's good enough? No, because what happened to the people when they get really bored? What did they start doing? You start picking up that the Babylonian gods are a lot like people. And this is what they kind of trying to make sense out of the world, try to explain the things that they see. But also when they look around, they realize, why do people work so hard? And the life on earth, life for people is not an easy thing to do. So, a mythology goes that the gods, after they created the earth, got so tired of helping themselves that they needed to find servants or slaves who would be working for them. And there they created humans. Not only created humans, because they still haven't resolved the annoying gods, they needed some material to create humans. So they killed the lower gods, and out of the blood of the god were created human beings. People are sitting doing, what is this? Who would want to go to school and learn this kind of stuff? But this is the history of the world in which Hebrew Bible comes in. This is the story. This is the dominant. This is how everybody thought the world came about. Why we need to even to know and talk about it sounds like so relevant even to spend time on this. Because we see the contrast between the story you just heard beautifully read, the story at the beginning, the story of Genesis. The story of Enuma Elish, on the one hand, is the story of violence, then the creation as a result of war and fighting, and human beings are basically created because somebody's blood was shed, and their destiny is to serve God's and to please God. On the other hand, we open the book of Genesis, and we see that God looks at the darkness, and this is what we talked about last week. God looks at the darkness and realizes the darkness is not a good thing, and the light comes in. And when the light comes in, it separates the darkness, pushes the darkness back, and all of a sudden, God starts speaking. God starts speaking the world into existence. Not because God is fighting with anybody, quite opposite. Because of the desire to create something that would be expressions of God's very nature. We talked about it last week. God is love. So out of love, God creates the beauty and harmony of the world. And how do we know that it is such? Because every time something is created, when the light and the darkness separated, when the firmament is created and separated, when the birds and the fishes, when the sun and the moon, everything is very, every day of the week, God steps back and says, this is good. God creates the world out of love. The world that we're supposed to be in, supposed to tell and reflect who God is, reflect the beauty, the harmony, the love, the care. And the metaphor that Bible uses for the world that was implied there, it's a metaphor of the garden. The entire earth, we say Garden of Eden as just a particular spot. The whole earth was the Garden of Eden. The entire space in which so many people live and occupy with all its beauty was one place, one garden. And we remember what happened next. Instead of enjoying the beauty of the creation, the garden that was created by God, humans became somehow, and it's a mystery, we don't have answer to that. How is it possible that the humans, instead of enjoying the created world, instead of enjoying the beauty of the gardens, humans became more interested in becoming more like God? Genesis chapter 3. To the woman he said, I will make your pregnancy very painful. In pain you will bear children. You will desire your husband, but he will rule over you. To the man he said, because you listen to your wife's voice and you ate, thistles will grow for you, even as you eat the field's plants. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread, until you return to the fertile land, since from it you were taken. You are soil, to the soil you will return. This beautiful garden, that place where people were supposed to enjoy, now becomes the place of pain, of suffering and a hurt. Not because it was originally designed so, but because something happens, and when the light got pushed back by darkness again, when the harmony gets destroyed and a chaos wants to come in, the world became the place of hurt. And this is something that we can understand and relate and see, but our world, the world that we see from the beginning, the world that's being introduced to us, was not designed to be that. It was supposed to be a beautiful garden. From a beautiful garden, it became a sweatshop. And the sweatshop, it's not just a metaphor, because it says right there when God speaks to Adam, it says, now you're going to sweat. You're going to work hard. And for women, you're going to bring your children in pain. Every time I read these words, I cannot help but reminds me my first summer, first full summer in the beautiful state of Texas. At that time, I was on a student visa, so I could not get a job anywhere else but on campus of the university. And apparently, in America, in order to live, you're supposed to drive a car. It wasn't the case where I came. I was 23 years old, and I didn't have driver's license. I never drove the car. It just happened to be that the chief of police in Keene, Texas, was the son of the evangelist I translated in the country of Belarus. And we became friends. He taught me how to drive. But he said, now you need the car. And I said, well, I would like to get the car. I just don't know how because we don't have any means to get a car. He said, well, why don't we do this? I cannot pay you because you don't have a visa, but we auction off cars from the police department, cars that people sometimes leave on the side of the road, nobody comes and picks them up. So we auction them off. And for you to auction it off, what I'm going to ask you to do, we need to paint curbs, like the no parking, red and yellow, around the city. And we need someone to do it. I said, would you like to do it? And I said, well, sure. Little I realized that this is Texas and this is summer. You need somebody from from Russia to realize that this is not the smartest. We have children not listening. That's good. This is not the smartest idea you can do. I'm talking about sweat. I remember taking the towel, dumping it in the ice water, wrapping around my head, and start working and that thing would dry on my head and just squeeze. Once they parked the police car there, I think he came to check out work or something, and I was painting, and police car never looked so attractive in my life. You know why? Because it was throwing a little bit of shade. So I was painting, and then with this thing on my head, I took my T-shirt off, and I was just exhausted, tired. So I have a red brush in my hand, and I saw that little shade from the car, and I could not resist. I just came and sat down in front of the car in the shade, in front of the police car with the red brush in my hands. I didn't give it a second thought until I see a car driving by. Imagine you're driving the car, there's a police car, and there's a guy with something red in his hands that's sitting by the car. And the person just slowed down to see what's going on. And she pulls in and she looks in the side. And it was one of my professors at the school, and she recognizes me. I've never seen people driving off so fast. She was afraid even to come to me and ask afterwards what happened, so I had to explain. Sweating and working hard, it almost feels like this world became a gigantic sweatshop. I thought I had it hard until we had our children. And I came and the day came for us to actually welcome Rita into the world. And I was standing there preparing, and our OBGYN, Dr. Gaia, she came, and she's like no nonsense, all business type of a doctor. And I'm standing there all frantic, just freaking out. And she said, "What's going on?" I said, I'm so stressed. I'm not doing good. She looks at Julie. She looks at me. She gives me that look. She says, "You are not doing good?" Having children in pain, women now. It's that kind of suffering, that kind of pain. How do we make sense out of the world that we knew was not designed, was not meant to be? Was not meant to be sweat, not meant to be experience pain and suffering. How do we move? How would you make sense? How do we go through this process? How did we move from the garden into the sweatshop, filled with pain and suffering? Is it possible to see God? Is it possible to make sense? Is it possible to see the light, to see the love that we talked about? And we realize that we live in paradox. We constantly live into this reality that on one hand, we know that God created this world. On the other hand, we realize that there's pain and suffering and sweat and hard work. How to combine this? This becomes one of the hardest dilemmas that humans ever experienced. How to make sense of the world in which we experience both. And sometimes between the love and the hate. Sometimes between the friendship and betrayal. Sometimes between the well-being and death. Can be very, very small distance. A split second. It all can change almost instantaneously. No wonder that people gone long and tried hard to resolve this, either by creating the myth and saying that the world cannot be good. It's a nonsense. From the beginning, it was fighting, it was war, it was suffering. From the beginning, it's pain. And this is how it meant to be because that's what we created for. Or people say it cannot be any good and there's no God because there's so much suffering and pain. And the resolution that people found is you either deny God altogether, and then you say if there's no God, then we can kind of understand why everything is not so good and how to make it good. We just work harder on ourselves. Or you accept the kind of God that punishes, the kind of God that watches, the kind of God that is strict, and every time you do something wrong, you're gonna get smacked. And your job as a human being to please God, live your life pleasing God. The world is not good, but there can be good in the world. But the perspective that the Christians, and this is why the sermon series is so important, that we look at the perspective that Christians have as Seventh-day Adventists on how to make sense on these difficult questions. There's no easy answers. But we begin to understand that the dilemma of being in the world and not being of the world is one of the most important for us to be able to reconcile and figure out. There's no such text in the Bible, be in the world, not be in the world, but as close, not exact those terms, but as close as we can get, we find in the 1 John chapter 2. Don't love the world or the things in the world, John writes. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in them. Everything that is in the world, the craving for whatever the body feels, the craving for whatever the eyes see, the arrogant pride in one's possession is not of the Father, but it is of the world. And the world and its cravings are passing away, but the person who does the will of God remains forever. This echoes the words of Jesus himself written in the Gospel of John chapter 17. Jesus prays, I'm not asking you, Jesus turns to his Father, that you take them out of this world, but you keep them safe from the evil one. They don't belong to this world, just as I don't belong to this world. Make them holy in the truth. Your word is truth. As you send me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. To be the world, to be in the world, but not to be of the world is the most difficult task that the Christians can have. And we wonder, how is it possible? How is it possible that we, moving out of the garden, preserve the garden life? It's not easy to do. And further we move from the garden, harder and harder it gets. More and more life feels like a sweatshop. More and more it feels like the story of Enuma Elish that we heard in the beginning and not the book of Genesis. Never-ending fighting for survival. And we imply all the means that we found implied in order to survive. Violence, betrayal, manipulation, deceit. Because in the sweatshop, this is how people survive. We work hard. We work hard thinking that it is by working harder we can get advanced. We can improve our standing. This is the rules of the sweatshop. The one who gets to the top is the one who works harder. And the truth about this world is that no matter how hard one works in a sweatshop, you can be the most successful one with the most power, with the most wealth. You can be on the very top. But you still will be just at the sweatshop. The rules of the sweatshop is that we can advance, we can make somehow to transform the sweatshop into garden by working harder. People use the different means to do that. But it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, if you're wealthy or young or old, brave or not, strong or meek. We're still all born in pain and we suffer the same way. And we continue like that pretty much for the rest of our lives. Having more is not going to get us out of the sweatshop. Having more power is not going to get us out of the sweatshop. According to Jesus, remember, he said it's easier for a camel to go through the needle's eye than for a rich person. Deserve whole new sermon there. Maybe we can do the whole sermon series on the camels and needle eyes. But seeing the reality, the humans became so creative in how to justify and make sense and feel better about the world that is not more than just a sweatshop. And people come up with all kinds of creative things. Some of it you already heard in the myth of Enuma Elish. So we're all going to suffer, and suffering is okay. And who does not suffer? All humans have to suffer, and those who are not suffer, they're not really humans. They become divine. So all the rulers of the ancient world, they were never fully human beings. They were what? They were almost divine. You have to be above human to enjoy life, how it meant to be, or have a pleasant life. People come up with all kinds of myth in the stories, like we heard about Marduk and Tiamat. Or in a more contemporary version of that is the kind of worldview that was very well described by a 19th century sociologist Max Weber. He said it's very interesting that the Protestant ethic, particularly he speaks about the Reformed tradition, the tradition that started with John Calvin in Geneva, Switzerland. The ethic in John Calvin's view, that's actually not his, but it kind of later developed. They believe that everybody, the God chooses who to save and who not to save. We don't know who's chosen. It's called the doctrine of predestination. It doesn't matter what you do, it doesn't matter what happens in your life, you are predestined to be saved, you will be saved. Doesn't matter what you do. And if you are not, as much as you try, you're not going to be able to do anything. That's God's proprietary right to choose. But people are not comfortable with that. They will say, okay, we need to come up with something that would show who is chosen and who is not. And what is the best way in the Western world do you know that somebody is really chosen by God? How do you judge that? What do you use? What are the objective things you can use to see if somebody is chosen by God? What do you use? It's a question for everybody. Huh? You use money. If you are successful, if you're rich, it means you're chosen by God. So how do people demonstrate their closeness with God and their chosenness by God? By making money. And the entire Western world, the society starts shaping by this idea that we need to become financially successful because financial success equals chosenness by God. So in the sweatshop, in order to have even a chance or to demonstrate that you have a chance to get out of there, you need to get ahead of everybody else. Unfortunately, the same kind of ethic made its way into the churches as well. Not only Presbyterian churches, not only Reformed tradition churches, but all churches. Because somehow we also decided that our well-being and those who are doing well in life, those who are quote-unquote can be labeled successful, are the ones who have the right relationship with God. It also took a step further, and we say, now, in order to be right with God, you have to work hard, not only making money, but you have to work hard on making yourself better. Because that's how you get to please God. If you try to improve yourself, and you start hearing these sermons that would say something, do more and do better. Try harder. If you are not successful in life, you need to try harder. If you don't have enough money, you need to pray harder and you need to work harder. People trying to say, if you want to be assured of your salvation, you need to try harder. If your church is not big enough, it means you're not trying harder. This is a very dangerous rhetoric of do more and do better, because it works both ways. Pastors tell their congregations, you need to do more, you need to try harder. That's both ways, because if a church is, quote unquote, is not doing what, or not where people will never find the satisfaction, which almost always the case, guess what the congregation does? Turns around, points the finger to the pastor and says, no, you are not doing better. You are not doing enough. And now we find ourselves in this struggle that we're accusing each other, not trying hard. And this is not uncommon to see the conflicts even within congregations and churches when people are just pointing fingers and saying, you're not doing enough. How do we know that we're doing something enough? That is not just an opinion. We come up with a set of rules. And if you follow all the rules, then you're doing enough. Jews perfected it. They had 613 rules that you're supposed to follow. You need to follow each one of them to the T, and if you're not following those rules, you're not doing enough. That's called legalism. Legalism is just another way to make sense or to justify the way of surviving in a sweatshop. Legalism. Try harder, do more. So when Jesus comes into this world and they start throwing him, remember the teachers of the law that come to Jesus, well, what kind of questions they ask him? They say, what do I do? What do I need to do to get there? What do I need to, how can I prove? Give me the formula, Jesus, because I want to get ahead. I'm trying so hard, I'm not getting what I want, where I want to get. This is the people who believe in God, but those who start trying hard, they pray hard and nothing happened. I had this conversation the other day with someone that said, you know, my daughter is so stressed about the school year. She was just appointed to be in charge of the school district that K through 12, she's in charge of the online learning. And this is now a new thing because schools now have to offer online learning as well as hybrid learning, in-class learning. And this is the whole new stress. And she is just in pieces. And she says, Mom, I've been praying about it, but praying it, and nothing happens. I don't think there's a point of praying because I don't seem like God is going to help me. The world is a sweatshop, not a garden. So what do you do if God is not helping you? You dismiss the presence of God and you say, I'm just going to live in the world not as a garden, but as a sweatshop. In the sweatshop, the rules are very different because in the sweatshop, it's all about efficiency, how to make things work. Some of the things that I understand that I share here maybe make us pastors a little vulnerable, but it's not uncommon now. If you look online, it's not a big secret. You go and Google the strategies for church growth and the seminars on church growth. A friend of mine went to one of those seminars, very successful church. It just happened to be even Seventh-day Adventist church. Very successful church, showed the growth many times. Hundreds of people came a couple of years, and the pastor of the church was given tips how to grow the church. And it's, you do this, and you need to come up this. And he said, one of the things that I do that blow people's mind, I put my wireless microphone, the headset that I preach with, and I take it with me, and I put the camera in the lobby. And when I talk to people, I ask them their names, and they tell me, and I repeat it in the microphone, and I repeat the whole conversation, and then I go back, and that's how I can memorize easily 70 people a week, their names. It's a good technique, I suppose. But you step back and say, what are we doing? Are we just about to bring in bodies and put them on the chairs? Or there's something more that is happening? What are we missing here? It's so tempting to start living by the rules of the sweatshop, where everything is about efficiency, everything is about getting ahead of others. It reminds me of a story. You've heard this probably many times. It's probably one of my favorite. I'm sure it's not a true thing, but it goes something like this. The two guys go through the forest, and a bear shows up, a big grizzly, like huge, just size of a mountain. The guys look at each other and they start running. Have you heard that one? And they just start running. And one guy turns to another and said, "Do you know how fast grizzly bears run?" I was like, "I know." Like, do you realize that we're not going to outrun the bear? It's like, "Well, I know." It's like, "Why are you running?" He said, "Well, I don't need to outrun the bear. I just need to outrun you." This is the world we live in when we try to outrun each other. And the scary thing is that we're even trying to do that in churches. That somehow subconsciously so gets in our minds that we start looking at each other, judging each other, and looking at each other and to see where we are spiritually comparing to each other. And we love to find, why are the rumors and things and this kind of things happening in the church? We say, wow, why the young people don't want to come to church? Because they come to church and they see and they call it number one reason that the generations, those who are younger than 30, don't come to church. You know, number one reason? He said, because church is hypocritical. Because people say one thing, and then when it comes down to things, they look at each other, and we do it subconsciously. I don't think anybody comes to church, driving to church today, say, "Well, I'm going to look around today, and I'm going to judge everybody." No, it's a second nature. Because we're people of the sweatshop, we come in, and we start looking and say, "Well, such and such, well, I'm not sure how she looks, how he does, what he does." And we start thinking, "Well, I'm not that bad." And we're doing this even subconsciously, thinking, comparing ourselves to others, and making us feel a little better. I don't need to outrun the bear. All I need to outrun you. We try to outrun each other. And this becomes the race. And we compete and we investigate. We like to learn stuff about other people. And say, "Oh, just catch somebody doing something," makes us feel almost that gives the satisfaction that we're not doing too bad. We judge and we call each other out. And down we go to this path of either legalism or atheism. Not realizing that either imposing religious guilt on people or denying God altogether, it's the same thing. People say, "Well, I'm followed God's rules. I'm not like those who don't believe in God." It's actually the legalism and thinking that God is just here to punish, or we can somehow improve ourselves by our own efforts, or not believing in God altogether. It's the sides of the same coin. This is the currency of the sweatshop. The contrast that we see today of the world that presented to us in the stories of Genesis, in the story I read to you of Enuma Elish, the contrast between the love and the fight, between the light and life and darkness and death, the contrast between God saying being truthful and multiply, and in Enuma Elish it says serve and please God. In Genesis, the world is the garden, and Enuma Elish is a sweatshop. How do we survive in this? How to make sense of this is either legalistic view or trying to prove ourselves, so work harder and do better doesn't work, or denying God is also not the path. And perhaps the answer is simpler than we can imagine, because it comes with a simple idea of what about if we start seeing the world not through our own eyes, but start seeing the world the way God sees the world. And God sees the world just like God saw the darkness and chaos in the book of Genesis. And in that darkness and chaos, God was able to see the beauty in the garden. God sees and looks at this world in the same eyes. That even in our world, God sees the garden that is there. It might not be visible, it might not be in our face, but God loves this world. And a very famous text, one of the most famous texts in the Bible, of course, is John 3:16, which is what? God so loved the world. But how many of us know by memory text John 3:17? Can you recite it? And I think it's no less important than John 3:16. John 3 verses 16 and 17. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that everyone who believes in him who won't perish but will have eternal life. We know that. 17, God did not send his Son into the world to judge the world, but that the world might be saved through him. John 3:17 says God did not send his Son to judge the world. God did not send his Son to come into the sweatshop and to rearrange things around. God sent his Son to open the doors in the garden again. Sometimes I hear this, that people say, well, I will fight for my church. I will fight for my faith. I will go to war. And my question always is, who are you going to fight? Who are you going to go to war with? Because one of the greatest divides between good and evil lies not between me and someone else, between us and them. The greatest divide between garden and a sweatshop lies right inside of our human natures. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, one of the Russian writers, said that the line between good and evil lies right across a human heart. Yes, there's plenty of darkness in this world. But what about if we look at this world not trying to armor yourself and to get more weapons against others, but why opposite do what God did? When there is darkness, God brings the light. When someone attacks your character, when someone disappoints us, when our leaders, our government, when our parents and our children challenge us, what if we bring the light? What if we find the dry land, and instead of throwing rocks at each other, what if we find the rock that we can stand on? And the story of the Bible is so beautiful that God has the dried, parched places and fills them with water. God can take the rock and make it a source of living water. And we find ourselves the living water that brings life into dried up gardens that we call human souls. So we're back in school, and we opened the book of Genesis today, not the story of Enuma Elish. And I guess the choice that is very simple for us. How would you see our lives? As a place of pain and suffering, living in a sweatshop, or we can start seeing the garden. Do we want to see the world that is rooted in a wars? Do we see a world that is full of judgment, the rumors? Do we see a world that doesn't have any kind of love and light present in it? It's a soulless machine that mechanically, and there's a whole another sermon we can dedicate, because part of the creation there was the tree in the middle of the garden, that the purpose of the tree was simply to say, of course, there's something to know about life, but not all knowledge brings you the joy. Sometimes knowing more is not necessarily gives you the peace. And in the tree, we find that all the places, amazingly, God was present in the garden except around the tree, that God allowed the space, allowed us to sort things out. And we were so fast to take God out of the picture. We talked about last week when Laplace famously said, in paraphrasing a little bit, that in his worldview, there's no need for God. So we look at the world as a soulless machine, that everything that is happening. And the danger of this is that if this is the case, that there's no such thing as a free choice and the free will. Everything you do in life, what you're going to have, what you're going to eat today, where you're going to go today, what you're going to do tomorrow, what's going to be happening in a year of your life, everything would be mechanically predicted, because everything is just physics. One of my professors wrote a book about did my neurons make me do this? Because if we don't believe in God, there's no free will. This world becomes just a gigantic clock in which every human being and every part is just a mechanical part that's destined to do its part, and you have no choice. People who say, I don't believe in God, You can't say I don't believe in God and at the same time I can choose what I want to do. You can't, because your chemistry, the society, the conditions is already going to predetermine. Only God allows the possibility of the free will, because it's in the sweatshop. No matter how much you want to convince yourself that you're free, you'll never will be. Where can you find freedom? Only one place, and one place only. And it was there from the beginning. And that place is called the garden. In Romans 1, Paul says that the challenge for us today is to be able to see the glimpses of garden in this world. Ever since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, God's eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen because they're understood through the things God has made. So humans are without excuse. Although they knew God, they did not honor God as God or thank Him. Instead, their reasoning became pointless and their foolish hearts were darkened. While they were claiming to be wise, they made fools of themselves. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images that look like immortal humans, birds, animals, and reptiles. So God abandoned them to their heart's desires, which led to the moral corruption of degrading their own bodies with each other. They traded God's truth for a lie, and they worshipped and served the creation instead of the Creator, who is blessed forever. It is the biggest lie of all times that by working hard in a sweatshop we can improve our world. We can make world to our liking. The possibility of that is the greatest lie ever told. But to seeing God in this world from the very beginning as act of life that is being present in a harmony, in a building relationship, in healing wounds, in ultimately offering Jesus and Jesus' life to the service of humanity, this reverses the idea that we are not here to please God or gods, but it's quite opposite. God will go out of God's way to be able to redeem us. So the church meant to become a living garden in which we don't have to fight or defeat, in which we meet Christ as the light that brings the darkness, as the light that defeats the darkness. And we don't have to fight against. We often find fighting against each other or even against ourselves. All we need to do to focus on bringing more light into this world. This is the way of the garden. Romans 12, verse 2. Don't be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, that you can figure out what God's will is, what is good and pleasing and mature. And guess what I want to say today, and to finish with this. It is not easy to find good in the world. In fact, there is only one condition on which it's possible. In order to find good in the world, only good can find good in the world. In order to be in the garden, we need to be people of the garden. But at the same time, who of us is good? And this is where the role of Christ becomes so important. That we can see the glimpses of the garden in this world, not through our own eyes, but through eyes of Christ. Because at Christ, when He came, He was able to see a beautiful person in a tax collector. He was able to see someone who's pure in a prostitute. Christ was able to see and look without the judging and to open up the garden again. One of the most important prayers for the world was in the Garden of Gethsemane. And from there, from the beginning to the end, we realize that it's not by our goodness, but no matter how hard we work and how much we work, but it's the goodness of God, the Creator, and Jesus, the Redeemer, and the Holy Spirit, our guide, that we can see the glimpses of garden and its beauty and its harmony and its joy and its love. And this is our world. The world according to the book of Genesis. The world 101. Amen.